Mia Harper took one last look in the mirror, quickly adjusted her light white dress, and tidied up her brown hair. She knew she looked young and beautiful, but there was something special about this evening, something exciting. This charity event, which gathered the cream of the local society, was an opportunity for her to see the life she had always aspired to. The event was held in the luxurious hall of a local hotel, full of light, crystal, and the delicate scent of expensive perfume. The guests, influential people of the town, dressed in elegant suits and evening gowns, enjoyed champagne and leisurely conversations. Mia worked here temporarily as a waitress, serving drinks and smiling. But at the same time, looking at the guests carefully, she liked to observe people, their manners, gestures, and the topics discussed, which seemed to reveal the secrets of this other fascinating life. And then, she noticed him. Henry Gibson, the owner of the hotel, looked up and held her gaze for a moment. He looked a little older than the other guests, with silvered hair and an unusually piercing gaze. He was not the usual handsome man, but he exuded a special power and authority that comes from those with power and influence. "Are you new here?" he asked, not taking his eyes off her. "Yes, I'm just here temporarily," Mia replied, smiling slightly. She didn't know how to deal with people like this, but something about the look in his eyes made her both curious and anxious. Henry was in no hurry to leave, watching her as if considering something. "Is this your first job?" he asked, holding up a glass of champagne. Mia nodded. She didn't want to let on that she was feeling a little uncomfortable under his scrutiny, but it was noticeable. Henry noticed her slight tension and smiled a little. "You must be very young to be working here," he said with a wave of his hand. Mia raised her eyebrows in surprise, not knowing whether it was a compliment or a remark, but now his attention had captured her. She realized that this was her chance to feel closer to the life she had dreamed of. As the evening went on, Henry remained close to her. He asked her questions, skillfully keeping the conversation going, and despite her caution, she began to open up to him. He was interested in her life, her dreams, and she was fascinated by the fact that such a serious and successful man was showing genuine interest in her. "If you want, I can introduce you to some interesting people," he said gently, as the event was coming to an end. His words sounded like an offer that promised more than just friendly assistance. Mia felt a little excitement, mixed with bewilderment. Why would such a person be interested in her? Their conversation lasted several minutes, but Henry did not seem to have any intention of saying goodbye. "If you ever need help or just want to talk, call me," he said, and with a nod, he left, leaving her with a slight confusion and a card that she was in no hurry to hide. Mia didn't know that this meeting would be the beginning of a difficult journey, but his gaze stayed with her, as if portending something disturbing and unusual. Mia lived in a small house on the outskirts of a town where everyone knew everyone. Her family was not rich. Her mother worked as a nurse, and her father, who had worked on construction sites almost all his life, was now without a stable job due to health problems. Despite the love in the family, their lives were burdened by a lack of money and a constant struggle for survival. Mia dreamed of breaking out of this environment and living like those who can afford an extra glass of champagne and beautiful evening dresses. After graduating from high school, she could not continue her studies at the university due to financial difficulties, so she worked wherever she could. In cafes, small shops, and now in a hotel, her work gave her a chance to at least partially immerse herself in the world she aspired to, a world of glitter, peace, and prosperity. As she watched the wealthy guests, she felt her desire for a better life, for opportunities she had not had, growing every time. Henry Gibson lived on a completely different side of the city, in a huge house with high iron gates, where the luxurious interiors looked cold, almost like a museum. The owner of a large hotel chain, Henry was well known and influential in the local community, but his life inside these walls was far from perfect. Married for more than 20 years, he and his wife Karen had raised 2 children who were now studying at prestigious colleges far from home. His marriage had long since become a mere formality. Karen, who had once attracted his admiration and respect, was now a stranger to him. She was only concerned with social events, prestige, and status, immersed in charity and participation in the life of a wealthy society. Their relationship had long been limited to formal conversations and the absence of any warm interaction. Henry realized that neither he nor she had any real interest in this marriage, but divorce seemed inappropriate. He did not want to destroy the illusion of the family ideal that was important to his reputation. This sense of emptiness and constant feeling of dissatisfaction fueled his internal conflict, as well as his growing desire to find meaning outside of his family. He was looking for someone who could give him a sense of importance, sincerity, and novelty that was missing from his gray, predictable world. When he met Mia by chance, her youth and innocence awakened long-forgotten emotions in him that he mistook for a chance at something real. At the same time, his family was becoming more and more distant to him. Karen, accustomed to the lack of emotion on his part, was busy with her own life, constantly attending events and demonstrating a public, ideal version of their marriage. The children, a daughter and a son, both young and ambitious, also had their own lives and did not feel the need to communicate with their father often. In this big, cold house full of expensive things, Henry was often alone, feeling weighed down by emptiness. He found in Mia an opportunity to feel alive, to believe that he still had power and meaning for someone other than his formal environment. Mia, although somewhat naive, immediately noticed that Henry was different from the men she had met before. His frank interest, even admiration on the one hand, caused her embarrassment, but on the other hand, gave her confidence. Although she suspected that they might have more than just a friendly relationship, this attention from such an influential man seemed to her an almost unimaginable opportunity. For Henry, Mia was more than just a young girl. She embodied for him the youth he had lost, the innocence he could no longer feel in his family, and an almost ideal that overshadowed everything else in his life. Now, his world was filled with her image, and the thought of her constantly lived in his head. He convinced himself that she would help him find the meaning of life that he thought he had lost in his world of empty formalities. Mia, in turn, saw in Henry something that brought her closer to the world she aspired to, not even realizing that this attachment could destroy her life. But even now, at the very beginning of their relationship, they were both on the verge of something dark and dangerous. Although they did not yet realize it, Mia lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, where everyone knew everyone. Her family was not rich. Her mother worked as a nurse, and her father, who had worked on construction sites almost all his life, was now without a stable job due to health problems. Despite the love in the family, their lives were burdened by a lack of money and a constant struggle for survival. Mia dreamed of breaking out of this environment and living like those who can afford an extra glass of champagne and beautiful evening dresses. After graduating from high school, she could not continue her studies at the university due to financial difficulties, so she worked wherever she could. In cafes, small shops, and now in a hotel. Her work gave her a chance to at least partially immerse herself in the world she aspired to, a world of glitter, peace, and prosperity. As she watched the wealthy guests, she felt her desire for a better life, for opportunities she had not had, growing every time. Henry Gibson lived on a completely different side of the city, in a huge house with high iron gates, where the luxurious interiors looked cold, almost like a museum. The owner of a large hotel chain, Henry was well known and influential in the local community, but his life inside these walls was far from perfect. Married for more than 20 years, he and his wife, Karen, had raised 2 children who were now studying at prestigious colleges far from home. His marriage had long since become a mere formality. Karen, who had once attracted his admiration and respect, was now a stranger to him. She was only concerned with social events, prestige and status, immersed in charity and participation in the life of a wealthy society. Their relationship had long been limited to formal conversations and the absence of any warm interaction. Henry realized that neither he nor she had any real interest in this marriage, but divorce seemed inappropriate. He did not want to destroy the illusion of the family ideal that was important to his reputation. This sense of emptiness and constant feeling of dissatisfaction fueled his internal conflict, as well as his growing desire to find meaning outside of his family. He was looking for someone who could give him a sense of importance, sincerity, and novelty that was missing from his gray, predictable world. when he met Mia by chance. Her youth and innocence awakened long-forgotten emotions in him that he mistook for a chance at something real. At the same time, his family was becoming more and more distant to him. Karen, accustomed to the lack of emotion on his part, was busy with her own life, constantly attending events and demonstrating a public ideal version of their marriage. The children, a daughter and a son, both young and ambitious, also had their own lives and did not feel the need to communicate with their father often. In this big, cold house full of expensive things, Henry was often alone, feeling weighed down by emptiness. He found in Mia an opportunity to feel alive, to believe that he still had power and meaning for someone other than his formal environment. Mia, although somewhat naive, immediately noticed that Henry was different from the men she had met before. His frank interest, even admiration on the one hand, caused her embarrassment, but on the other hand, gave her confidence. Although she suspected that they might have more than just a friendly relationship, this attention from such an influential man seemed to her an almost unimaginable opportunity. For Henry, Mia was more than just a young girl. She embodied for him the youth he had lost, the innocence he could no longer feel in his family, and an almost ideal that overshadowed everything else in his life. Now his world was filled with her image, and the thought of her constantly lived in his head. He convinced himself that she would help him find the meaning of life that he thought he had lost in his world of empty formalities. Mia, in turn, saw in Henry something that brought her closer to the world she aspired to, not even realizing that this attachment could destroy her life. But even now, at the very beginning of their relationship, they were both on the verge of something dark and dangerous, although they did not yet realize it. A few days had passed since the charity event where Mia had first met Henry, and the encounter was still on her mind. She tried to recall his expression, his calm but piercing gaze, and to feel again the warm attention he had given her. She hadn't expected him to call so soon. She was a little embarrassed that he had invited her to dinner, but Henry emphasized that it was just a meeting during which he would like to discuss opportunities that could help her with her career. According to Henry, it would be a friendly conversation, nothing more. He didn't show any hint of flirtation, but spoke with a confidence and conviction that she couldn't refuse. Mia found herself in a luxurious restaurant, where the soft light of the lamps reflected in the crystal glasses, and the atmosphere seemed almost fairy tale-like. She had never been in a place like this before, and even simple things like the exquisitely patterned tablecloth or the soft music seemed special to her. Henry sat across from her, acting with natural confidence. He asked her about her plans, her interests, listened to her talk about the work she was forced to do. "You are very ambitious," he said, raising his wine glass and looking at her closely. "I like people who know what they want out of life, and it seems to me that you deserve more than the job you have to do now." Mia smiled, albeit a little tensely. Henry's words sounded nice, but she didn't fully understand what he was getting at. Did he really just want to support her, or did he have some other meaning behind his words? Henry seemed to read her mind. He raised his hand and nodded to the waiter, who in a moment brought a small velvet box and placed it in front of Mia. She froze for a moment, looking at the box, and then carefully opened it. Inside was a thin gold bracelet, delicate, with small diamond inserts that sparkled under the light of the lamps. "Is this for me?" She couldn't contain her surprise. "Yes, for you," Henry replied, smiling a little as if her surprise amused him. "It's just a small token of my appreciation for letting me spend this evening with you. And also," he leaned in slightly, "a reminder that if you ever want to develop your career or do something more meaningful, I can help." This offer sounded very attractive, and Mia's dreams of a better life re-emerged in her heart. Henry was an experienced man who could open up new opportunities for her. His words awakened in her a desire to change her life, to reach those heights that had previously seemed unattainable. It seemed that fate itself was offering her a chance to escape poverty and fulfill her potential. But something was still wrong. Henry tried not to look away from her. His attention seemed too intense, even suffocating. He touched her arm often, seemingly casually, but too insistently. Her inner voice tried to warn her, but something deep inside told her that opportunities of this magnitude did not just happen. Dinner was coming to an end, and Henry offered her a ride home. She hesitated, but agreed so as not to offend him by refusing. She was embarrassed by the way he looked at her during the short ride in the cramped space of the car. He seemed to be paying too much attention to her, as if trying to remember her in every detail. "You know," Henry said when they pulled up outside her house, "you're a special girl. It's rare to come across someone with such determination and inner strength. You can go far, Mia, if you let me support you. She thanked him for the dinner and the gift, feeling both grateful and tense. She dreamed of the opportunity that came with meeting Henry, but the thought of his gestures and insistent stare kept coming back to her. Does he really want to help her? Or does his interest go beyond mere support? Mia went home with the bracelet on her wrist, but also with a heavy feeling in her heart. The jewel on her hand was beautiful, but it felt foreign, like a symbol of a debt she hadn't fully realized. That night, she lay awake for a long time, wondering if she should accept Henry's help and continue the relationship, or if she should leave it alone while there was still time. Mia was used to Henry writing or calling her from time to time, sometimes inviting her to dinner or a walk where they could discuss her plans for the future. But lately, his attention had become obsessive. He appeared in her life more often than she expected. Sometimes he would just walk up to her after work, waiting for her to leave, or send her a text asking where she was, and if he could give her a ride. At first it was nice. She never thought a man of his status could be so interested in her. After meeting him in a restaurant, he regularly sent her small gifts, elegant jewelry, expensive perfume, even a designer coat she had always dreamed of buying. Mia didn't know how to react, but she was attracted to this luxury. It seemed that with every gift he gave her, he opened the door to a world she was so eager to explore. The flattery hidden in his gestures was pleasant, and the feeling of attention was almost intoxicating. But over time, something began to bother her. He called her often, and even if she didn't answer right away, Henry always found a way to find out where she was. One day, he showed up at the cafe where she worked part-time, brought her a new phone with a contract, saying that he wanted them to be able to stay in touch. Mia didn't know how to refuse, and although she didn't feel good about it, she accepted his gift, trying to find an excuse for his actions. "You know," he said that day, looking at her with his unwavering gaze, "that I just want the best for you. You deserve it. He touched her hand, holding her fingers in his a little longer than necessary. Mia smiled, but inside she felt a little embarrassed, even anxious, though she tried to calm herself. Henry hadn't done anything that could be overtly described as indecent or excessive, but she no longer felt free in his presence. Soon he began to visit her even at home. One evening, when she came home from work, she saw his car parked outside their small house. He said he wanted to make sure she was safe. And when he noticed she was tired, he immediately suggested a vacation at his private cottage in the countryside, a place where he said they could get away from all their problems. "Mia, I'm not used to being turned down," he said quietly. His tone was calm, but she could sense a warning behind the pressure. "I just want to help you. You shouldn't have any doubts about that." He said it as if she had no right to refuse, and at that moment, Mia had an unpleasant feeling, as if she had already stepped into some kind of trap that would be difficult to escape. She felt that his generosity was bordering on control. Nevertheless, she continued to maintain this relationship, trying to ignore her fears. She was drawn to the future Henry promised her, and she had no idea how far he was willing to go to keep her close. Mia gradually felt that her relationship with Henry felt more like a burden than a privilege. The attention that had once seemed almost fairy tale-like turned into suffocating control. She began avoiding his calls, refusing his invitations, making excuses not to meet him, but this only seemed to fuel his interest and irritation. Henry showed up more and more often without warning. One evening, when Mia returned home, she found him on her porch, as if he were just waiting for her to return. His eyes betrayed his impatience, and his movements were sharp and cold. "I couldn't wait for you," he said, not even giving her time to go inside. "I was worried." "Henry, you have to understand," she began, trying to find the words. This is too much for me. I didn't ask for any gifts, and now I feel obligated for everything you've done." His face remained calm, but his eyes glittered with displeasure. "Obligated?" He twitched. "Mia, I'm doing this because you're important to me. I'm not going to let you run away from me after everything I've given you. I've invested my time, my feelings in you. I know you want this. You're just scared. Henry, she took a step back, feeling her heart clench with fear. This is not the relationship I wanted. His face twisted into a cruel smile. He walked slowly toward her, not giving her a chance to escape, and Mia could feel fear making its way down her spine. Scare you? I scare you? He raised a mocking eyebrow. Mia, you belong to me. You can't just turn around and walk away when I've gotten used to you, when I've invested so much in you. Every day his behavior became more and more aggressive. He tried to control her schedule, showed up at her work, visited her friends, found out who she was spending time with. He even started talking about a future together, hinting that they should start living together. Henry, this has to stop. Mia finally decided to say when he entered her house uninvited. This is not love or even friendship anymore. It's something else. And I'm scared. Scared? His voice became mocking. I've given you everything I could, and you feel scared? He took a step forward, forcing her against the wall. Her heart pounded in her chest as he grabbed her shoulders, holding her tighter than she expected. You can't run away from me, Mia. No one is allowed to ignore me. You are my property. You belong to me now. The words seemed almost like a sentence. She realized that Henry was not only fascinated by her, he was obsessed with her. This feeling had nothing to do with love. It was a thirst for possession that left him no room for compromise that evening. Mia sat in the dark for a long time when Henry finally left. She realized that this relationship was not bringing her joy, but only fear and discomfort. She realized that this was more than she could handle, that she was trapped in a situation that she could not break on her own dot. Mia hadn't answered Henry's calls for several days. She tried to stay away from him, realizing that this was the only way to stop his obsession. That night, Henry decided he would take matters into his own hands. He knew where to find her, and despite her refusals, he drove to the small house on the outskirts of town where Mia lived. His thoughts were confused, his obsession clouding his mind. He was not going to let her go without letting her know how important she had become to him. When Mia opened the door and saw Henry, she was filled with fear. She immediately realized that this time he had come with a clear intention, and he would not stop with words. We have to talk, he said coldly, leaving her no choice. Henry, I don't want to see you anymore. Please go away. Mia's voice trembled, and she took a step back, trying to close the door. But Henry quickly slipped inside, forcing her to retreat into the darkness of the small hallway. No, Mia, you can't just ruin all this. You can't just walk out on me. His voice rang out loud in the silence of the house. I don't want this anymore, Henry. This isn't love. It's a prison, he said, making her even angrier, and she felt the air in the room grow heavy with his anger. I've done everything for you. I raised you. I gave you opportunities. How dare you abandon me after all this? His voice sounded fierce. His eyes glittered with fire. He took a step toward her, and she backed away, bumping her back against the wall. I never asked for this, Henry. I don't want your gifts. I don't want to be your property. Her voice was loud, but with every word she felt his anger only grow. She was afraid of that look in his eyes, which had become truly dangerous. Unable to stand the tension, Henry grabbed her shoulders in a fit of anger. His hands were pressing too hard, and Mia tried to break free. A struggle began between them. At that moment, he lost control, and Mia felt her body hit the wall. Her head hit the door jamb painfully, and she fell to the floor, silently limp. Henry froze in place, staring at her motionless body. His heart was racing, but his face remained blank, as if his mind refused to accept what had happened. He slowly sank down beside her, trying to bring her to life, calling her name softly. But Mia didn't move, and with each passing second, the truth began to sink in. He had killed her. His instincts, which had kept him in business for so many years, told him that the only way to get away with it was to hide the evidence. He began to remove anything that might indicate his presence. He gathered his belongings, carefully wiped down the places he had touched, trying not to leave a single trace. Eventually, he stood up again, staring at Mia's motionless body, and felt anger flare up inside him. It was her fault. She made him lose control. After gathering the evidence, Henry left the house, slamming the door behind him. He quickly got into his car and drove off into the darkness, leaving behind the house that had been the last witness to his horrible act. It was a gloomy day when Detective Alex Miller arrived at the crime scene. Mia's body was found in her home. Her neighbors had noticed that they had not seen her for several days and finally contacted the police. The young girl, whom many in the town knew and loved, was now lifeless and left behind many secrets. Detective Miller was known for his meticulousness. He carefully examined the scene, paying attention to even the smallest details that others might consider unimportant. He was an experienced detective who understood that sometimes one little thing can turn the whole case upside down. Mia's house was in a mess, indicating a struggle. Objects were lying on the floor, chairs were overturned, and he noticed a subtle drop of blood on the wall. Alex knew that such traces, while not always revealing the perpetrator, could shed light on the course of events. He ordered his team to carefully examine every corner of the house, leaving no stone unturned. The first thing that caught his attention was a broken bracelet lying next to the body. It was an expensive piece of jewelry, not typical of a girl of modest means, and Alex wondered how she could have gotten it. He carefully examined the bracelet, noticing small scratches and a broken clasp. It looked as if it had been torn off during a struggle. The next thing he found were fingerprints on the door jambs and on the furniture in the room. Some of them belonged to Mia, but the detective also noticed other prints, larger ones, probably male. Alex sent them to the lab for analysis, hoping it would help him get on the suspect's trail. The detective also noticed another detail. On the floor, next to the door, he found a thin trail, as if someone had dragged something heavy or hurriedly carried something out. This trace could indicate that the criminal was trying to hide evidence or even planning to cover his tracks. Interviewing witnesses gave Alex his first clue. Mia's neighbors told him that she had been seen recently in the company of an influential man from the city. Some of them knew it was Henry Gibson, a wealthy hotel owner. He often visited her, sometimes staying until late at night. The neighbors admitted that sometimes they heard raised voices and even screams, but no one wanted to interfere. Henry Gibson's name had been mentioned several times, and Miller decided that he was the person to talk to first. But before that, he wanted to get even more evidence that could link Gibson to the crime scene. Alex managed to find out that Henry was married, and this led him to believe that any relationship with a young girl could have caused Gibson serious problems, which could have made him a motive. The investigation continued. Miller and his team interviewed everyone who knew Mia, trying to understand the nature of her relationship with Gibson. Some of Mia's friends recalled that she had seemed depressed lately, avoiding socializing, and a friend admitted that Mia had even told her that she felt trapped, but did not explain why. A few days later, Miller received an expert report. The fingerprints found in Mia's house partially matched Henry Gibson's. This was already a significant piece of evidence, but Miller wanted to get even more. Soon they found another thing that strengthened his suspicions. Mia's bracelet had tiny traces of skin and blood on it, likely left over from the abuse. Laboratory tests showed that the blood samples were not only Mia's, but also contained genetic material from another person. This gave Alex sufficient grounds to obtain an arrest warrant for Gibson. Every small detail that seemed insignificant at first was now forming a complete picture. Henry Gibson was in Mia's house that night. He left traces not only at the crime scene, but also on the girl's body, which became indisputable proof of his presence and involvement in the tragedy. Alex Miller realized that Henry was unlikely to confess voluntarily, but the detective knew he had enough evidence to bring Gibson to justice. Having gathered all the pieces of this intricate story, he was preparing to meet the man whose obsession and thirst for control turned into a death sentence for a young girl. The evidence against Henry Gibson was enough to take the case to the next level. The crime that had shaken the town was now the main topic of discussion. Residents, who had always seen Gibson as a respected businessman, could not believe that he was involved in the horrific death of a young girl. The case was accompanied by an atmosphere of shock and sadness that enveloped not only Mia's family, but the entire community. Detective Alex Miller had one final conversation with Henry. It was a confrontation where the detective, confident in his evidence, gave him one last opportunity to confess. but Henry continued to insist on his innocence, hoping to avoid responsibility. "You have no right to accuse me," he said coldly, holding his ground. "You have no idea how much I've done for this town, for the people. I was her friend. I supported her. It's her own fault that this happened." Alex replied calmly, "You call that support? All these traces, fingerprints, crumbs of her blood on your skin? All this is not support, but direct evidence of your obsession. You destroyed her life, leaving her no choice. At the conclusion of the interrogation, Detective Miller handed over all the evidence to the court. Witnesses, expert testimony, and the physical evidence found convincingly indicated that Henry could not control his obsession and committed the crime when he felt he was losing control of Mia. The trial did not last long. The evidence was overwhelming, and despite attempts by Henry's lawyers to change the course of the case, the judges delivered the only possible verdict. Gibson was found guilty of murder. His obsession, which began as care and support, turned into a tragedy that left no one in the courtroom indifferent. When the judge announced the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was heavy. Henry stood there with a cold expression that hid his despair. He seemed to have only now realized the extent of his actions, but it was too late to make amends. The obsession and thirst for control that had completely taken over his mind led to an irreversible tragedy. The town was left stunned. Everyone who knew Henry was trying to understand how a respected businessman could be at the center of such a terrible tragedy. Mia's family and friends were partially relieved that the perpetrator had been punished, but no amount of court decisions could compensate for the loss of the young girl. This story became a cruel lesson for the entire community. The moral that emerged from this tragedy was simple but profound. The desire for control and obsession can lead to catastrophic consequences, destroying the lives of both those who give in to these feelings and those who get in their way. Mia was an innocent victim who found herself at the center of an obsession that turned into a sinister force. And Henry became the embodiment of the danger that unhealthy desires and the inability to accept rejection conceal. This sentence was not just a punishment for one person, but a reminder to everyone of the consequences of an overwhelming desire for control and a thirst for power over another person.